Imagine being forced to do something that you know is wrong. Imagine being punished for trying to protect those you love. Kenneth Young was only 15 years old when his mother's drug dealer approached him and demanded that he assist with an armed robbery, or else the man would harm his family. Young complied, but despite preventing the rape of a young woman and only committing the crime to save his mother, he was given not 1, but 4 life sentences. Although the US makes up only 4% of the world's population, its prisons house over 20% of the world's prisoners. The tax dollars it takes for the upkeep of such overcrowded prisons is the least of the injustices involved. Arbitrary incarceration is the deprivation of liberty of the individual without due process of law, as a part of a widespread or systematic attack directed against a civilian population. This issue especially targets people of racial minorities. Disproportionate amounts of prisoners are African American or Hispanic or even non-citizens. This issue has led to overflowing prisons throughout the nation, with very limited success with rehabilitation. Young is one of many young people of color who have been wrongly convicted and given sentences unfair to their crimes and especially their ages. Diane Jones was wrongly convicted of drug trafficking and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Ian Manuel spent years in a tiny isolation cell because at 13, he was sentenced to die in prison. Diane Tucker was wrongly convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Triana Garnett was just 14 years old when she was tried as an adult and sentenced to life in prison. Though children are certainly not the only victims of arbitrary incarceration, their stories are the most jarring. 32% of US prisoners are Hispanic, while only 17% of the population is. Though only 13% of the US population, African Americans make up 40% of prisoners nationwide. In poor communities of color, 50 to 60% of young men are in jail or prison or on probation or parole. Mass incarceration is especially unjust to people of color and those born into poverty. Bryan Stevenson, founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, graduate of Harvard Law School, professor at New York University Law School, and the author of the award-winning memoir, Just Mercy, A Story of Justice and Redemption, is a lawyer who dedicated his career to helping children who are given unjust sentences. Stevenson believes that in the United States, we have a system of justice that treats you better if you are rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. Wealth, not culpability, shapes outcomes. Stevenson works mostly in Alabama, which some may call the most racist state. It's also the state that uses the death penalty most often. However, though the problem is most rampant in the South, it's not as far from home as we might think. In a survey taken in Utah by 46 people of all ages, 20% knew someone personally who was wrongly convicted and sentenced to time in prison. The kinds of wild scenarios you would hear on a Spanish soap opera are passing through courts and forcing innocent people to serve time. One person's grandfather was framed for the forgery that was actually committed by his partner. Someone else was in prison for an accidental manslaughter. That might sound pretty bad, but what really happened was someone died in a car accident. There's no drinking, no texting involved, but because the other guy died and not him, it was automatically his fault. Putting someone in prison for unintended manslaughter doesn't do good. The money they have to pay and the guilt is their punishment, says the respondent. Someone from the Holiday area was pulled over because a tail light was out, which escalated to them getting shot at by the police and arrested. Because of race, a lot of things are assumed in many situations, and they are not being handled properly by the courts or police. Another response reads, an unfair instance I've come across was a cop shooting, where the girlfriend was in the car against her will and leaned over for a few seconds to steer while her boyfriend shot at the cops. Her boyfriend got off without a sentence while she served for 7 years. I hear these sorts of crazy situations all the time in the news and from the mouths of social activists. However, hearing it from the people I know, from my community, has changed my perspective on the issue. Like most people I surveyed, before doing research, arbitrary incarceration wasn't really something I was passionate about. However, after writing more, it's clear to me why it's constantly in the media. Arbitrary incarceration specifically targets people of racial minorities and the less fortunate, and it needs to be put to an end in America.